Lecture notes taken by two students, arranged by themselves, so the authorship is not certain, okay, has been published as course on general linguistics in 1916. The assessor died in 1913. We are going to talk about this. Actually, the reception of the book was quite different in different countries. It began suddenly make its impact in certain countries, but as far as I remember, the first translation of the book, it was written in French, the first translation of the book in English has to wait as late as 1955 or 6 or so. Okay. It had a very revolutionizing impact, and first of the revolution comes with the new understanding of the import of language in our lives. Now, our primary concern here, the starting point, is to how to relate our thinking with our language. Okay. Now, the general, well-established approach was this, and I guess even most of the cases now, most of us tend to think in this way as well. We have certain thoughts in our minds, and I use language, to express them to the others. What do you think about this? Now structuralism gonna change this and follow another supposition. Okay, it would simply say that one cannot have thoughts, at least in an understandable fashion, without language. Okay. What do you suggest yourselves? Do we have really thoughts if we didn't have any language? This is the starting point of any possible structuralist viewpoint, actually. Okay. Structuralism would claim that without language, we wouldn't have any thoughts in an understandable and communicable fashion. Okay? We may have a mass of mingling thoughts in our minds, perhaps. Perhaps nobody can deny this possibility, but not understandable thoughts, let alone communicable. Okay? This is the first basic premise. Okay? Actually, our author says that I'm not sure if we all became aware of this, but our author claims that we have become aware that what we think is conditional on the structure of the language in which we think. What do you yourselves think about it? This would have very important, very enormously important consequences. What's your opinion? Come on. I'm sure that you are thinking individual human beings, or at least having the capacity to think, okay, on the one hand. And on the other hand, you use a certain language. You know? So you are in the position of somehow answering the question. You yourselves have the experience of thinking and making use of language. What do you say? Sometimes one has to take sides in these discussions. Okay, you don't say anything. Okay. Now the implication will be enormous, but let's start from the beginning. Okay, Ferdinand de Saussure was born in, I don't know when, 1857. Okay, when he arrived at the age of what, 21, which means 1878. Okay, he delivers his dissertation, 1878. If I do not miscalculate, okay, at the age of 21, he delivers his dissertation entitled, what was that? Dissertation on the primitive vowel system in Indo-European languages. Okay. So what's at stake here is the investigation of the A, the letter A, okay, in the Sanskrit language. Okay, Sanskrit, an Indo-European language, so Saussure tries to compare the vowel A in its different usages and tries to find out arrive at some certain generalities with regard to the formation of the letters and vowels in the alphabet, okay, in a given language. Now, the difficulty is, however, that from the very beginning, Saussure turns out to be aware that studying the modifications that a single vowel undergoes in a given definite language requires studying all the other vowels as well, all the other sounds in a given language. Okay? What does this imply? To be able to understand what A means or how A is formed. You know, our general supposition is that in a given language, or not only in a given language, universally speaking, there are definite sounds. Huh? There are definite A's, as, is, oo's, öz, ü's, etc. Now the unfortunate problem is that if you compare different languages, you'll find out that you are not gonna be able to hear actually. Okay, there are some sounds that you are not going to be able to hear, let alone identify with any letter, let alone identify within any meaning structure. Okay. For instance, the Norwegian sound. That was a strange sound, actually, written by the letter Y, you know, Ye, Turkish Ye. That sounds something between E and U, okay, which when I was trying to learn the language, I would never be able to utter in the form any Norwegian would be able to understand. Okay? So there are many sounds like this. For instance, Turkish I. Okay? For a speaker of any Indo-European language, it turns out to be quite difficult to hear I and locate its place in the sound system of any language. Okay? So this shows us something important. Okay? This shows us that in any given language, the sounds are not there by themselves. Okay? But what Saussure discovers over there by studying the Sanskrit A, okay, or in English A, okay, he finds out that actually the possibility of discerning any sound in a given language requires the study of all of the other sounds in that language as well. Okay? Simply because one can only locate one certain sound within the system of other sounds. Okay? Why? Simply because, again, there are no sounds given by themselves. Okay? Well, this turns out to be an important discovery for Saussure, and a theme which he will use in his lectures is one of the important components of the structuralist system. Okay? And apart from this, when Saussure enters into the study of language, the discussion was this in those times, okay? Studying one single language or a particular language, English, French, Turkish, etc., or is it possible to study the language in its general sense, okay? The language, in other words, that general characteristics that can be found in each and every language. The emphasis on this notion of the language, which according to Saussure in his time linguists had lost sight of, okay, turned out to be an important concern for him. And he tried to approach the study of the language from a different perspective which was prevalent in his own time. Okay? He identifies the popular approach of language as a diachronic, you know. And in contrast to diachronic approach, he proposes some synchronic approach. Now, diachronic approach emphasizes the study of the historical or temporal relations or changes taking place in language. Okay? For instance, a good example of such an approach would be etymologies. You know? Trying to trace the root origin of a given word in a certain language, for instance, okay? Try to locate its time period and try to study how it evolves or changes or replaced by other words, other elements in language, etc. Okay. On the other hand, however, synchronic approach, which has been proposed by Saussure, involves taking language at a certain period of time. And that period of time, according to him, is determined by the presence of the same collective consciousness. Okay? This means that actually studying language as it was used, for instance, in a certain generation. Okay? So giving up, trying to trace the temporal relations of the elements of language, their temporal transformation, historical transformation, whatever, and try to understand language through the study of its components as they are at the same period of time, as they are together at the same period of time. Okay? This allows Saussure to take the language and conduct his studies of language by accepting language as if it presents a system. Okay. Actually, he never uses the term structure. Okay. The only single term he uses in that regard is system. Okay. So the requirement is simple. Let's try to study language as a system rather than unpredictable sequence of events, change, transformations taking place in time. You know, the historical transformations of the words can take place due to many factors, and most of which could well easily be non-linguistic. Okay? The relationships among the societies, the subduing of one society by another one, or the confrontation with another society, having a high culture, so on and so forth, may force actually many changes to take place in the language of a people. Okay? But when you take language without considering all these transformations as it is used by the members of a society at a certain period of time, okay, what you'll get is a more or less organized, that's why you turn out to be able to call it as a system, or Saussure calls it as a system, okay, more or less organized elements, okay, components, each and every one of which being interrelated with other components, okay. This is why for a structuralism, for the later studies as well, it turns out to be quite important, okay, that synchronic approach rather than the diachronic one, enabling the student to take language, the phenomenon of language, as a system. Okay? Now, for instance, Saussure writes, or does not write actually, lectures that synchronic linguistics will be concerned with logical and psychological connections between coexisting items constituting a system, as perceived by the same collective consciousness. Okay. I'll return back to this term, which plays a very important role once again in structuralism, collective consciousness. Okay. Despite synchronic linguistics, according to Saussure, diachronic linguistics, on the other hand, will be concerned with connections between sequences of items not perceived by the same collective consciousness, okay, which replace one another without themselves constituting a system. Okay, so this capacity of taking language as system and establishing a relationship between the system and collective consciousness has a peculiar import in structuralism. This would enable structuralism to make a distinction, or Saussure primarily, later on structuralism, enable to make a distinction between what he did call la langue and la parole. And usually translate into English as the language and speech. Now, as you may easily guess, when we talk about speech, what we are referring to are nothing else than the actual speech acts of the individual members of a given society speaking a certain language. Okay, not only speech acts does not only contain all these speaking activities, as well as activities of writing and so on. Okay, all those activities which have been actualized within the framework of a certain language by the users of that language. When we speak, for instance, Turkish, English, or in whatever language, we are realizing a certain speech act. Okay? This is what constitutes the real of the language, so to speak. I'm not using here the real in its technical sense, but rather by this, what has been materialized, what has been come out, okay, into the world. You hear my voice speaking, and you come to appreciate that my sayings has a certain meaning, okay, have a certain meaning. So this is the speech act, okay, we all share together. However, when it is talking about la langue, or if you like, the language, it's something different. While the speech acts turns out to be realized through the individual speakers of a given language, okay, la langue or the language has never been realized, okay? It is not the property. The simple reason for this is that it is not the property of the individual, but rather it's the property of the society, okay? So its location, its place, according to Saussure, is not the individual mind speaking the language, but rather it's reserved, if you like, in the collective consciousness of a people. Okay. This point will prove itself quite important in structuralism, simply because now I'm going to say something more in relation to structuralism that and this will show its significance. So, before saying this, before directing our attention, let's write down here that language is the property of the society. Which is expressed by Saussure as collective consciousness. There was a beautiful extract in that regard. If I can find it, I would be happy to read it to you. Okay. When speaking of the language, not the speech acts, okay, he says that it is a fund accumulated by the members of the community through the practice of speech. Okay? A grammatical system existing potentially in every brain, or more exactly, in the brains of a group of individuals. For the language is never complete in any single individual, but exists perfectly only in the collectivity. Okay? So, according to him, actually this, I guess, I'm afraid, is a very important thing to note that he describes here. We haven't arrived yet its true meaning. He describes here the language as the social bond, through and through. Okay? We haven't yet realized, come to appreciate its true and deeper meaning of this expression. But for the time being, it's well enough for us to state that while the individuals partaking in the universe of a language, when they are speaking, realizing the language, so the whole reality of language passes through the speech acts of the individuals. Okay? So in that regard, the individuals are important and their speech acts important simply because without them, a language would never be realized. Therefore, it would turn out to be impossible to talk about the existence of language. But yet, on the other hand, we come to realize that no one single individual can master the totality of the language, so there is always missing in the individual usage. Okay? Therefore, this points to another location rather than the individual mind. Okay? A mind of the community. Now, I know that this is an abstract concept. If I did say, for instance, only the society community, perhaps it might have seemed to you as if I am talking about a much more concrete entity, but it was not. Okay? As we have seen that society does not have that concrete reality in itself, but nothing but a concept, okay? So why not the collective conscious? We develop another concept and attribute the location of the language to it, okay? The common, accumulated, generation after generation, accumulated and inscribed knowledge and experience of a certain society in language, okay? So a language here then functions as a repository of the experiences of the community on the other hand. Okay. Yes, so la parole turns out to be the speech acts of language, and language, however, exceeding the limits of individual usage should be conceived as belonging to some other entity. Okay. Now, the following observation was in relation to the character of the vowel A or any sign in any language. Okay. This is the point of differentiation between the European or Saussurean linguistics or structuralism and American structuralism. Okay. American structuralism attributed the value, the meaning to the sentences. Okay. Therefore, concentrated on the study of the grammar. While, however, for Saussure, it turned out to be the sign, what he called as the sign, as the basic unit of the language. Okay. We are now talking about the sign, roughly, not always necessarily, but roughly corresponding what we call in ordinary usage as the words of the language. Okay. Sign, practically speaking then, primarily refers to the words. So Saussure conceives that unit of meaning or units of language, linguistic units are signs, which roughly corresponds to the... This will give him an advantage over American structuralism, which concentrates on the studies of syntax and grammar, simply because reducing the level of analysis to the signs or to the words, okay, will allow Saussure to study many other elements by the side of the grammar as well, okay, without rejecting the requirement of studying the grammar at the same time. Though this leveling of the analysis allows him to open up a completely new field of research. Okay. Now, what this sign is, okay? A sign, according to Saussure, is a constituent element, okay, composed of two different components. According to him, a sign should be understood as the inseparable unity of the what he calls signifier and the signified. Okay. You know, each and every word in a language, whether in its spoken form or written form, does involve a material element. Okay? A sound, perhaps when speaking, or a grammatical sign or graphical sign when writing. Okay? A material element. So, for instance, these dark lines, curved dark lines on the board, okay, constituting the material element of the sign. Well, however, when you read through one particular word, for instance here, express, okay, you will get a certain meaning. This is the unmaterial element of the sign, okay, or if you like, the mental element of the sign, okay. So a sign is consisted of these two elements. On the one hand, that material element, the sound you hear or I utter, or the graphical component that you put on a piece of paper or board, and the figures you see on the board or on the piece of paper, okay? While at the same time, since they are inseparable, you associate them with certain meanings, okay? But don't forget, even though I said that the signifier turns out to be primarily a material element, it is not in the sense of a material conceived independent of the mental processes. Okay? Simply because, as you will see, any any material component, any sound, for instance, that I might make, okay, does not indicate that it turns out to be a part of the language, okay? So in the structure of the sign, both the meaning and the material component, the sound if you like, are closely, inseparably connected with each other. The sounds without meaning does not constitute the part of language, but can simply be considered as noises. You know? While on the other hand, there can be no possibility of uttering a meaning, okay, without that material component. So even though I say that one is material, the other is mental, actually in the final analysis, the totality of the sign, including that material component of the signifier, okay, turns out to be mental, okay, simply because each and every material sound or encarved engraving does not make a sign, okay, does not constitute a part of the language, okay. Deciding what sound, what material element is part of the language, requiring a mental process, if you like, okay. So therefore you decide that something, some certain sound turns out to be a sign, being a part of language, or not, having no meaning at all, okay. Therefore not being a part of language, okay. So even the materiality of this signifier turns out to be the result of a mental processes. Okay? Don't forget. As you can understand, however, now in accord with our earliest first premise, okay, this signified turns out to be something quite interesting. Okay? While the material character is already showing some interesting points for us. Okay, when we direct our attention to the signified part, we find out something more interesting, okay? What we call the signified here in structuralism is not the things, okay? What we call, for instance, let's write down a word here, a sign, horse. Now the sound horse and the written graphic constituted of the letters horse here, okay, is what we call the signifier of a sign, signifier part of the sign, okay. But what you get by the horse, okay, is the signified. And don't forget, what you get by the horse is not that animal, okay? You should never confuse. What you get by the horse, okay, in the system of language is nothing else than a certain concept, okay? The concept of the horse in my thinking. So the signified does not refer to the actual things, okay? But rather to the mental constructs or concepts in the speakers or speakers of the language. Okay, so is that clear? For instance, let's put here the third element, and you will see how this argument, how this position is in connection with the earlier theoretical philosophical positions. Okay. Now, where was that? So the concept of the horse, and I can as well count a third element, okay, which is usually referred as the reference. The actual animal. What? What's this? Now, this turns out to be a crucial and interesting moment for structuralism simply because it declares, by saying this, it declares that language is somehow independent or autonomous from what you may call reality. Okay? And structuralism showed this by pointing out to the what they call the arbitrary character of the sign. Now this means actually that the referent is somehow outside of the language, that the sign within the system of language does not give expression to the referent, but rather than to a certain idea, okay? A certain concept implies that the system of language is somehow autonomous in its relationship with the reality, okay? This autonomy can easily be seen in the arbitrary character of the constitution of the sign. Okay, we say that it's in two senses arbitrary. First of all, think about this signifier part. Okay. Now we call that something, that idea, never forget, not the real horse, the idea, that concept of the horse with the sound horse in certain languages. In Turkish we call at. In German, Pflege or something, I forgot. Or in any other language with any other sound. Okay? It means that it turns out to be impossible to establish a relationship between the signifier, okay, the constitution formation of the signifier, and neither with the concept we have, let alone forget about the actual horse. Okay? However, this was contrary to the well-established idea, especially adopting the diachronic method. You know, all etymologies ultimately preferring or trying to trace the constitution of the words to this originary relationship with nature. Okay, the originary relationship first taking place between human beings and nature, so therefore trying to connect, trying to find out the roots of the words in this primitive sounds that we utter when we come across with a certain thing. Okay? But if that was the case, then you could rightfully expect that, okay, in languages, in every language, okay, these sounds expressing certain ideas, or if you like, forget about the ideas, certain things, or our relationship with certain things, would turn out to be somehow traceable or reducible to each other. Traceable, or at least to a one single root. You know, that was the originary theory of language, the language of Babel, okay, out of which every language began to flourish, differentiating themselves. So if you concentrate on a particular language, finally you would be able to trace the relationship of that language back to that original language. You could call it as well Suleiman's language too, you know, Suleiman knowing the original language, being capable of communicating with everything, birds, other animals, so on and so forth. Therefore, communicating, forget about communicating with the other people, okay? Such a language would enable anyone to communicate whatever with anything else, not anyone. However, here in structuralism, assuming a synchronic approach to the questions of language, what they find out is this, okay, that the relationship between the sound horse and the concept horse, forget about the that animal horse, okay, is arbitrary. That's it. Okay. There was a revolution, as you'll see in a moment, simply because, again, it functions to prove the autonomy of the language from the reality. What does it mean, autonomy of the language from the reality? Okay? Now, if reality is what we think, if reality is what we experience, if reality are the things that we experience, okay, if the language is not autonomous, then you can expect from a language to express as much as correctly and loyal to the reality of the things. Okay? But however, such an analysis, as such an analysis has shown, okay, language turns out to be some autonomous system which is not determined by the reality of the things, and in turn we're gonna see that rather how it turns out to organize the reality of the things in its turn. Okay? This is why it is important, and actual first step in our appreciation of that organizing power of language. Organizing power of what? Of language over what? Over the world. Okay? So, another point that I would like to make with regard to this curious relationship is this. Taking the referent out of the linguistic analysis as a result of this awareness of the autonomous character of the language, okay, actually, does it remind you anything? Does it remind you anything we have discussed so far? It means the exclusion of the real, so to speak, or let me use here the Kantian terminology, the exclusion of the nominal world out of the symbolic expression, okay? So symbolic expression, language, therefore, does not express. It is not an instrument in expressing the real world, if you like, the nominal world. The nominal world being forever outside of the reach, if you like, using the Kantian conceptualizations, outside of the reach of the being expressed within the language. Okay? But we have said that language, in contrast, however, does not get shaped by the reality, but on the contrary, it's itself organizing the reality. Okay? If it does not change what the real horse is, it means that it changes our relationship with the real horse. And by changing our relationship with the real horse, it shapes our experience with the real horse, and therefore it has the power to define what a horse is for our thinking. Okay? Sorry?
It's also about phenomenology.
Duyamadım.
It also resembles the phenomenology. So there is no...
Not exactly. Now, phenomenological study is somehow related with the absolute structures of intentionality, so to speak. There were definite modes of intentionality producing almost the similar effects on the object of intentionality, so on and so forth. Here, however, everybody would necessarily recognize the differences or different organizations of the world through different languages. Okay? For instance, the famous saying that the Eskimo has 16 different words for white, while in contrast, as far as I know, in Turkish, we have only 4 or perhaps 5. Okay? Beyaz, kır, başka, boz, perhaps, başka, what else? Beige? Beige, not why? Ak, kır, kırık beyaz. Kar beyaz, okay, that white. Okay. Okay, 4 or 5 words, okay? Each, we know that this native speakers of the language Turkish know that, okay? Each is slightly different from the other, even though we are quite conscious that they all refer to some kind of whiteness, you know. These whitenesses are nevertheless not the same. Now, think about the Eskimo having 16 different words for the white. Now, the question is, how many whites are there in the world? Are there 4 or 5 whites in the world, or 16 different whites in the world? What do you say? For the Eskimo, of course, okay, we don't know the real white, the referent, as you see, okay? We don't have any idea about what the real white, okay? And we don't care about it, okay? What we are concentrating rather on, how many whites we can differentiate in our own experience whose possibility had been opened by our usage of one single definite language. Okay? Now, for the Eskimo language, there are 16 whites. Which one is correct? Is there one white only, common to universal to everybody else, okay, as the unshakable element of the real? Or are there just 5 or 6 whites, as the white has been experienced by the Turkish people? Or are there 16 whites, as the Eskimo experiences them? What's your decision?
I thought that those mode of experiences example to structuralism, like public experiences.
Yeah, mode of experiences has been structured through language, it appears so, but the problem is that neither this structuring nor their expression, okay, has no relevance with what we call reality. Out of this, we cannot even infer that there is one single white in real, or there is 16 whites in real. There are, how many? 5 whites in real. There is no way of discerning what kind of whiteness there is in reality. Okay? The important single point is this, okay? So the question of reality, or if you like here in the terminology of structuralism, referent, turns out to be fall outside of the analysis of any possible study of language, okay? It's something similar to the question of, say, poverty or happiness, you know? Some of you as sociologists is going to study poverty, for instance. Trying to classify poverty, trying to define poverty, okay? How are you going to define poverty? Are you going to think that poverty is part of the real world and you are conducting an objective study concentrating on the real characteristics of poverty? How are you going to do that? Or rather, try to conceive poverty in so-called relative terms, okay, in your comparison with what you consider as non-poverty, and accordingly decide what are the differentiating marks of poverty. For instance, people talk about in their studies of poverty as the level of subsistence. Okay. Is there an absolute such level as the level of subsistence? What is the level of subsistence? Now, all these relevance show itself when Saussure enters into the analysis of this sign, okay, within the structure or system of signifying chain. Now, what is a sign? Okay, we have seen that sign is a constituent something, okay, a complex something composed of 2 elements, okay, each of one of which having or displaying a different aspect of the sign, okay. And we can rightfully ask, after we have said that the constitution of the sign is rather an arbitrary process, okay. This has several implications, one of which is quite dangerous actually, that the formation of the sign as the unity of the signifier and the signified has no relationship with the actual reality or whatever you call it, on the one hand. It may give you the impression, nowadays quite popular, okay, calling everything constituted, constituted, constituted. It may give you the impression that you, as the individual subject, would be able to modify this relationship of the sign, okay, or the relationship of the signifier with the signified in accordance of your own preferences. Okay. Okay, the relationship, we said that the relationship between the signifier and the signified is quite arbitrary, but don't forget, this does not mean that. Okay? The individual speaker can make modifications in a rather arbitrary fashion in this relationship. Okay? This relationship is arbitrary, meaning that there is no necessity between the necessarily enforcing relationship, if you like, between the signifier and the signified, but what's there, and this is one of the hidden meanings of understanding language as the social bond, okay, that this relationship had been established by convention after long years of usage by the society. Okay? So we said that language does not belong to the individual. Language belongs to the society. Okay? And the establishment of such relations between signifiers and the signified is the result of the long usage of this relationship in a structure of the sign by the society, not by the individual. Therefore, neither the individual nor a part of the society can easily make modifications in this relationship. So when we say construction of, when we talk about the construction of certain things, for instance, national identities, Turkish national identities, we say identity is constructed, okay? Or sexual identities, gender identities, whatever you may understand by the term, are constructed. Okay, we say constructed, but constructed here does not mean that they can be deconstructed. Okay? Constructed here does not mean. Constructed here means that these are not natural phenomena. It implies that an individual should necessarily have a national or ethnic identity or sexual identity or whatever, okay, is not necessary. But after long usage by the society for the particular individuals living in that society, they turn out to be partaking in these constructions, if you like, turn out to be a necessity. Okay? It's not up to the choice of the individual. So by constructed, we do not mean that they are constructed by some intelligent mastermind, okay? Or some social group. For instance, analysis of ethnicity, especially development of ethnicity, usually connects the formation of national identity to the rise of the bourgeoisie. Okay? So middle class, or if you like, okay, if you do not use the Marxist terminology, you may use the term middle class, okay? Now, middle class trying to develop a national identity within the society. This, at the first sight, may seem a good idea, but as far as I understand, this is not in accord with the premises of the structuralism, simply because, according to structuralism, as we will see, okay, through long usage by the society, by the community, okay, and don't forget the autonomous character of the language at the same time, they have been organized within the system of language, and even though there is no necessary relationship between the signifier and the signified, that relationship cannot be broken down at any moment when one wants to do so. Okay? So meaning that this relationship arbitrary does not mean that it can easily be subjected to change, modification. Okay, let's have a break.